Alfred Granger had 3 rules about women on his ranch, and every last man on his payroll knew them by heart the way they knew the Lord's Prayer, not because they believed in them, but because breaking them meant consequences swift and final as a bullet through dry timber. The first rule was simple enough. No woman set foot inside the stable without his express permission. The horses were his pride, his livelihood, the beating heart of everything he had built since he was 19 years old with dirt under his fingernails, and nothing but a $40 saddle and a borrowed mare to his name. The stable was sacred ground. The second rule was equally clear. No woman touched the ranch books. The ledgers, the tallies, the contracts with the cattle buyers out of Abilene, those were his alone. He had been swindled once, 7 years back, by a sweet-faced woman in Dodge City who had smiled at him over a dinner table while her brother cleaned out his bank account using forged figures Alfred himself had naively left exposed. He had learned. He had built a wall of numbers around himself as solid as the stone foundation beneath his ranch house, and no woman was going past it. The third rule was the one that made his ranch hands laugh among themselves on Saturday nights when they thought Alfred was out of earshot. No woman gave orders to his men. She could ask. She could request. She could bat her lashes until the wind changed. But no woman issued commands on the Granger spread, because the Granger spread ran the way Alfred ran it: clean, straight, efficient, no sentiment. 3 rules, no exceptions. He had kept them for 4 years without a single incident. That was before the morning of June the 14th, 1883, when the stage from Amarillo rolled through the gate of his ranch at 7 o'clock in the morning and deposited one Celia Mercer onto his property like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples did not stop for the rest of his life. Alfred was at the fence line when the stage arrived, watching one of his wranglers, a lean young man named Pete Hollies, work a reluctant bay gelding through its paces in the near paddock. He heard the wheels on the hard-packed road before he saw the coach, and he turned with the patient unhurry of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that trouble always found its own way to his door. The stage was dusty and road-worn, the kind of vehicle that had seen too many miles and not enough maintenance, and it rocked to a stop just inside the gate before the driver climbed down and opened the door with the tired gallantry of a man doing a job and not much else. What came out of that stage was not what Alfred expected. She was tall, nearly as tall as Pete, who was not a short man with dark auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen better days, the brim tilted at an angle that managed to look both practical and defiant at once. Her traveling dress was a deep blue-gray, not fine by any measure, the kind of dress a woman chose for durability rather than impression. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a rolled document in the other, and she was looking at Alfred's ranch house with an expression of concentrated assessment that he recognized because he had worn it himself 100 times looking over someone else's cattle. She was cataloging the place, taking inventory. Alfred walked toward the stage with unhurried steps, thumbs hooked in his belt, and when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he said, "This is private property." The woman turned and looked at him, and he got his first full look at her face. She was perhaps 26, maybe 27, with sharp dark eyes that caught the early morning sun and threw it back like polished flint. There was a smudge of road dust on one cheekbone, and she did not seem to notice it or to care. Her jaw was set with the particular firmness of a woman who had been argued with too many times and had stopped being polite about it. "Mr. Alfred Granger," she said. Her voice was clear and direct, with a trace of somewhere more eastern, not a city voice exactly, but not plains-born either. "That is me," Alfred said. She thrust the rolled document toward him. "Then this is for you. I am Celia Mercer. Your brother hired me." Alfred stared at her for a long moment without moving. Then he took the document, unrolled it, and read it with the thorough deliberateness of a man who did not skim things. When he was done, he read it a second time. Then he rolled it back up and held it at his side and looked at Celia Mercer with an expression that gave away approximately nothing. "My brother," he said at last, "is dead." Something shifted in Celia's face. Not shock exactly, more like a recalibration, the way a navigator looks when the landmark they were steering by turns out to have moved. "I know that," she said quietly. "He died 2 weeks after he signed this, but the contract is binding, Mr. Granger. He hired me to assess and reorganize the financial management of this operation, and his signature is on that paper along with the seal of Mercer and Associates, and I have come a very long way to do the work." Alfred looked at the document again. His brother Daniel's handwriting was there, no mistaking it, the looping D, the backward slant of the capital G in Granger. Daniel had always done everything Alfred could not stand. Hired people without asking, made decisions that were not his to make, left complications behind him like a trail of dropped tools. Even dead, apparently, he was still doing it. How far? Alfred asked, not because it mattered, but because he was not ready to say the things that needed saying quite yet. 3 days by train from Kansas City, then 1 day by stage, Celia said. "Which is relevant, Mr. Granger, because it means I have already invested considerable time and expense into a contract your brother believed in strongly enough to pay a month's retainer for, and I would very much like to begin." Alfred breathed through his nose. The sun was moving up the sky, and the horses needed checking, and Pete was still standing by the paddock fence, pretending to be occupied with his own business while watching everything with the transparent interest of a man who had nothing more pressing to do. "I will show you to the guest room," Alfred said finally. "We will discuss this at breakfast." Celia Mercer looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "I would actually like to see the stable first. Your brother's letter mentioned some discrepancy in the horse sale records from last autumn, and I prefer to start with the physical inventory before I open the books." Alfred stopped walking. He turned back to her slowly. Rule 1. She had just asked to break Rule 1, not even knowing it was a rule in the first 90 seconds of her being on his property, with the same calm, matter-of-fact tone she might use to ask for a glass of water. He was about to say no. He opened his mouth to say no. The word was right there, solid and familiar, the same no he had used a dozen times before. But Celia Mercer had already looked away from him and was speaking to the stage driver about her trunk, handing him a coin from the small purse at her wrist with a murmured thank you that somehow managed to be both efficient and genuinely warm. The driver tipped his hat to her with a degree of respect that Alfred noticed the man did not bother extending to Alfred himself. The rolled document in Alfred's hand had his dead brother's name on it. "The stable is this way," Alfred said, and he heard the words come out of his own mouth with a kind of astonishment that he hoped did not show on his face. It did not show. He had spent too many years learning to keep his face still. He led her across the yard, past the cookhouse where his cook, an older man named Ezra who had been with Alfred since the early days, was visible through the open window watching the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. Celia walked beside Alfred with the confident stride of a woman who was not performing composure but simply had it, and she looked around the yard with those assessing eyes, and Alfred found himself looking at his own property the way a stranger would, which was unsettling. The stable was large and clean, 12 stalls with good ventilation, tack room at the far end, the smell of hay and leather and horse, and the particular clean, dusty warmth that Alfred associated with everything right in the world. 3 of his best horses were in their stalls, the big roan stallion Cassius, the dun mare he called Patience, and a young gray who had not yet been named because Alfred had not yet decided what he was. Celia walked straight to Cassius's stall and looked at him with serious attention. Cassius, who was suspicious of everyone including most of Alfred's own hands, stretched his neck over the stall door and blew softly through his nostrils at her in what was, by Cassius's standards, a near declaration of friendship. Alfred stared. Celia put her free hand up and let Cassius smell it, then stroked his nose once twice, with the unhurried ease of a person who had been around horses her whole life. "He is a magnificent animal," she said, not to Alfred particularly, but in the general direction of the stable air, the way people spoke when they meant something and did not need acknowledgement for it. "He does not usually take to strangers," Alfred said. "Most horses are better judges of character than most people," Celia said, and moved along the stall row, counting, noting, her lips moving faintly as she did some internal accounting. Then she stopped and turned to him. "Your brother's letter mentioned that a consignment of 6 horses was sold last October to a buyer named Whitmore out of San Antonio. The sale was recorded at $210 for the lot. Is that accurate?" Alfred crossed his arms. "What does that have to do with the Financial Review?" "Because 6 horses of this quality, Mr. Granger, and I can tell the quality even from what I see here, would fetch considerably more than $210 in any honest sale. Your brother suspected the figure was wrong. I would like to see the original receipt." Alfred looked at her for a long moment in the amber morning light of the stable, the horses shifting quietly around them, Cassius still watching Celia with an expression of equine approval that Alfred found frankly irritating. His foreman, a heavy-set man named Doyle Crenshaw who had been with the ranch for 2 years, had handled the Whitmore sale. Alfred had not personally overseen it. He had trusted Doyle's accounting because Doyle had always given him clean numbers, and Alfred was a man who extended trust until he had reason to withdraw it. Suddenly he was less certain about that trust than he had been 10 minutes ago. "The books are in my office," he said. "Rule 2. He watched himself say it. He watched himself walk toward the stable door with Celia Mercer following, her leather satchel over her shoulder and her hat still tilted at that angle. And he was aware in the very back of his mind that he was about to do the thing he never did, which was allow a woman into the books, and he could not quite locate the part of himself that was supposed to stop it from happening. His office was in the main house, a small room off the front hall that smelled of pine resin and ink, with a wide pine desk and shelves holding 3 years of ledgers bound in brown leather. The window looked out over the front yard, and the early sun came through it in a long, clean stripe across the floorboards. Celia set her satchel on the chair across from the desk. Alfred's chair was behind it. The other chair was for visitors, and opened it with efficient movements, producing a notebook, 2 pencils, and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that she settled onto her nose with the practical gesture of a woman who needed them, and had long ago stopped caring whether they made her look severe. They did not make her look severe. They made her look like someone who was about to discover the truth. Alfred brought the October ledger down from the shelf and set it on the desk, and opened it to the relevant page. Celia leaned over it, one finger tracing the columns, and Alfred stood to the side and watched her work and told himself it was nothing, it was merely business. It was a contract his dead brother had signed, and it would be sorted out in a day or 2 and she would leave. "There," she said, after perhaps 4 minutes. She tapped a column with one finger. "The receipt total is recorded at 210, but look at the notation beside it. Your brother put a small mark here, do you see it? This kind of mark he used elsewhere in these records to indicate a discrepancy he had noted but not yet investigated." Alfred leaned over the desk beside her, close enough to catch the scent of her something clean, faint, like cedar soap and road dust. He looked at the mark. It was small, a tiny bent line in the margin, and it was there. He had never noticed it. "Daniel was in Kansas City when the sale happened," Alfred said slowly. "He was staying with Aunt Ruth. He would have been working from copies of the records. So he had access to copies, and he noticed the discrepancy, and he hired me before he could investigate it himself," Celia said. She straightened and looked at Alfred with a directness that he found both unsettling and, in some reluctant corner of himself that he chose not to examine at present, refreshing. "Mr. Granger, I think it is very possible that you have been shorted a significant sum by whoever handled this sale." "Doyle Crenshaw handled the sale," Alfred said. "Then I would suggest that you and I go through the full ledger for the past year before you speak to him. Celia said. So that you have every figure confirmed and in order. You do not want to make an accusation without evidence. Alfred looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. The deliberate, orderly part of him that had built this ranch from nothing recognized good advice when it walked in the door. I will send Ezra for coffee, he said. Celia almost smiled. It was a small movement at the corner of her mouth, barely there. That would be appreciated, she said, and settled into the visitor's chair and opened her notebook. And Alfred Granger stood in the doorway of his own office and realized with the slow, heavy certainty of a man who has just looked at the horizon and seen weather coming that his rules had already lasted approximately as long as the morning dew. The work took the better part of 3 hours. Celia moved through the ledgers with a systematic precision that Alfred found himself watching with something close to admiration, though he kept that observation strictly behind the wall of his face. She did not rush. She did not skip. She cross-referenced numbers against their source entries with patient exactness, and when she found something that did not balance, she did not announce it with drama, but simply noted it in her book with a small, precise notation, and moved on to the next column. By 10 o'clock she had found 3 separate discrepancies in Doyle Crenshaw's accounting, totaling. When Celia added the figures and showed Alfred $147 over 8 months. Not a fortune, not a ruinous sum, but on a working ranch running on the margins that all working ranches ran on, $147 was months of supplies, a new saddle, the difference between breaking even and coming up short in a hard winter. Alfred sat back in his chair and looked at the figures and felt a very old, very familiar anger move through him. Not hot anger, but the cold, deliberate kind, the kind that had an edge like a well-kept knife. I want to be certain, he said. I am certain, Celia said, but I understand why you would want to verify it yourself before proceeding. Take the evening to look it over. I have made notes on each entry. She pushed the notebook across the desk toward him. Everything is marked and cross-referenced. Alfred looked at the notebook. Her handwriting was spare and exact, nothing decorative about it, every number clear and every notation terse. It was the handwriting of a person who wrote for function and not for show. He did not say thank you. He was not sure why. He said, "Where did you learn this?" Celia took off her spectacles and looked at him directly. "My father was an accountant in St. Joseph, Missouri. He taught me the work from the time I was old enough to hold a pencil. When he died, I took over his practice because my mother needed the income and I was the only one who knew how. I did it for 6 years. Then I saw an advertisement from a firm in Kansas City looking for someone with experience in financial assessment for agricultural operations specifically, and I applied." She paused. "I was the only woman who applied. They hired me because I was better than the other applicants. I know that is not what men usually say about a woman they have hired, but it is what happened." Alfred regarded her. There was no particular defiance in the way she said it. Just the same flat accuracy she brought to the columns of numbers. "And my brother found you through this firm," he said. "He came to the Kansas City office with a concern about his stake in this ranch," Celia said. "He wanted an independent assessment before he decided whether to invest further or sell his share. He said," she paused here briefly, and something in her eyes moved. "He said he trusted his brother to run the ranch well but not to catch someone stealing from him, because honest men are often the last to suspect dishonesty in others." Alfred was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like Daniel." "He was a kind man," Celia said. "He spoke highly of you." Alfred stood up. The morning sun was coming through the window at a full angle now, and it was past the time he should have been out checking on the eastern fence line, which had been giving trouble all week. His day was already unraveling in the way days did when unexpected things arrived in the gate at 7 in the morning. "There is a room at the top of the stairs," he said. "Second door. Ezra will bring your trunk up. Supper is at 6. Celia nodded. She was already putting her spectacles back on and returning to the ledger. "I would like to finish the November accounts before I stop," she said, not as a question. Alfred was at the door. He turned back and looked at her, this woman he had known for 3 hours, sitting at his desk with his dead brother's ledgers open in front of her, wearing the spectacles that made her look like the most focused person he had been in a room with in several years. "Miss Mercer," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for what you have found so far." She looked at him for a moment with those sharp, steady eyes. Then she said, "You are welcome, Mr. Granger." He went out into the yard, and the sun hit him full in the face, and somewhere behind him he heard Ezra humming in the cookhouse, and the horses in the paddock calling to each other, and the whole morning feeling somehow different than it had been before the stage arrived, as though the air had been reset to a new frequency that his instruments were still calibrating. He did not notice, until he was halfway across the yard, that he was thinking about her eyes. He stopped walking for approximately 2 seconds, identified the direction of his thoughts with the grim recognition of a man who knows a dangerous trail when he sets foot on it, and deliberately redirected his attention to the fence line. The fence line was a great deal safer. Doyle Crenshaw was out at the western pasture that morning, overseeing the movement of 60 head of cattle to the better grass. Alfred rode out to him on Patience, taking the long way around so he could check the eastern fence as he went and make the ride useful. The fence was holding mostly, though 2 posts near the creek bed needed resetting before the next hard rain. He found Doyle near the gate of the western pasture, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, with a full mustache and the permanently squinted expression of a man who spent too much time looking into the sun. Doyle had been a capable foreman by every measure Alfred had used to measure such things, which did not include, apparently, checking whether the man was honest with the accounting. Alfred did not confront him. Not yet. He needed to be certain, the way he had told Celia he did. He watched Doyle work and said nothing about the ledgers, and rode back to the ranch in the late morning with the certainty sitting in his chest like a cold stone that he was going to have a very hard conversation before the week was out. At noon, Alfred passed the paddock fence on his way to the cookhouse and stopped cold. Celia was standing inside the paddock, not just inside the paddock. She was standing in the middle of it with the young gray horse, the unnamed one, at her shoulder, and the gray was following her with a loose, willing attention that it had never once offered Alfred, and Celia was walking in slow, easy circles, while Pete Holly stood at the fence with his hat in his hands, and watched with the reverent expression of a man witnessing something he does not fully understand but recognizes as good. And Pete Holly's was following Celia's instructions. She had said something. Alfred caught the tail end of it as he came closer. "Move him to the right fence line, just bring him easy, do not crowd his shoulder," and Pete had nodded and moved to do it, and the gray had stepped over with the soft, willing movement of a horse that felt safe. Rule 1. Rule 3. Both of them simultaneously before noon. Alfred stood at the fence and looked at this for a moment. Celia had not yet noticed him. She was focused entirely on the horse, her hat pushed back now so the sun fell full on her face, one hand at the gray's neck in a light, steadying touch. She said something low to the horse that Alfred could not hear, and the gray lowered his head and stood easy. Pete looked up and saw Alfred, and had the good sense to look slightly embarrassed, though not embarrassed enough to take a step back from where he was standing. Alfred opened the paddock gate and came in, and Celia turned and looked at him with the same absence of guilt that she seemed to bring to everything. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself immediately. She waited for him to speak first, which, he was beginning to understand, was a thing she did. She waited and watched, the way a good surveyor waited to take the measure of the ground before marking it. "This is the stable area," Alfred said. "You need my permission." "I know," Celia said. "I asked Ezra and Ezra said it was all right." Alfred turned and looked toward the cookhouse. Through the window he could see Ezra's shoulders shaking with what was almost certainly laughter. "Ezra," Alfred said, not loudly, "does not have authority over the stable area." "I realize that now," Celia said, and she did look briefly apologetic, a quick, genuine compression of expression that was over in a moment. I will ask you directly next time. But Mr. Granger, since I am already here, this horse has not been working correctly. Look at how he holds his left foreleg. He is compensating for something. It is not severe yet, but if it is not addressed it will worsen. Alfred looked at the gray's left foreleg. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had been looking past for a week without seeing. The horse was standing with a very faint but distinct easing of weight on that leg. Not a limp, not yet. A beginning. He went to the horse's side and ran his hand down the foreleg, found the heat at the tendon low, barely there but present. Early stage tendon strain. If he had caught it in another 2 weeks, it would have been considerably worse. He straightened and stood very close to the gray's shoulder and was aware that Celia was on the other side of the horse's neck, close enough that the horse's breath moved between them. "You have an eye for horses," he said. "My father kept 2, she said, "and I have worked with enough ranching operations to read the signs." Alfred stepped back from the horse and looked at Pete. "Get Jim to poultice that foreleg this afternoon," he said. "Light exercise only for 2 weeks." Pete nodded and went to do it, taking the gray by the lead with the ease of a man who knew horses, and Alfred and Celia were left standing in the middle of the paddock with the midday sun overhead and the high blue Texas sky pressing down on everything. "About the 3rd rule," Alfred said. Celia looked at him steadily. "You have rules about women specifically," she said, not accusatory, just noting it. "I have rules about the management of this ranch," Alfred said. "And those rules include women not giving direction to your hands," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "It has been necessary," he said. "There have been situations." "I am sure there have been," Celia said. "And I am not here to run your ranch, Mr. Granger. I am here to audit your books. But when I see something that affects the value of the assets I am auditing, I am going to mention it. That is the job." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The sun was very bright. "The horse's left foreleg," he said. "Affects the value of the asset," she said. The most infuriating part, Alfred thought, was that she was entirely right, and he knew she was entirely right, and she knew he knew it. "I will revise the rule," he said, and heard his own words with something like disorientation, the way you heard a familiar song played in an unfamiliar key. Celia almost smiled again. "A little more of it this time. Come to dinner," he said. "Ezra does a reasonable noon meal." They walked across the yard together, and Alfred was aware of every step, aware of the shape of her stride beside his, aware in the way you became aware of a new sound you had never heard before and then could not stop noticing. Over the noon meal, salt pork and pan bread and good strong coffee, Alfred told Celia about Daniel. Not because she asked, but because the subject of his brother seemed to have settled between them like a shared obligation, a thing that needed to be spoken aloud. "He was 4 years younger than me," Alfred said. "He had no interest in the land. He liked books, liked numbers. That was how he knew to go to your firm, I suppose. He had a stake in this property from our father's will, and he never interfered mostly. He visited twice a year and drank Ezra's coffee and argued with me about cattle prices and went back to Kansas City. He told me he was proud of what you had built," Celia said. She was eating with the easy directness she brought to everything, not performing delicacy about it, just eating because she was hungry, which somehow made the meal feel more honest. "He also apparently thought I could not catch a man stealing from me," Alfred said. "He thought you trusted too much," Celia said. "There is a difference." Alfred looked at her. "Trusting people is not a flaw," she said. "It is what allows you to build something like this." She gestured with her coffee cup toward the window, toward the yard and the horses and the whole of the Granger spread in the full noon light. "A man who trusted no one could not keep a single hand on his payroll long enough to build a ranch this size. The flaw is not the trust. It is the absence of verification." "You sound like my brother now," Alfred said. "I imagine that is partly why he hired my firm," she said. They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that was, Alfred noticed, entirely comfortable. Not the strained silence of 2 strangers who had run out of small talk, but the easy quiet of 2 people who did not need to fill all the air between them. He noticed this. He cataloged it. He filed it somewhere in the back of his mind, where he kept the things he was not yet ready to examine, and went back to his work. The next 3 days had a rhythm to them that Alfred would remember for the rest of his life, with the precise, indelible clarity of things that changed everything. The days themselves looked ordinary from the outside. Celia, in the office with the ledgers and her spectacles and her neat-noted books, Alfred in the yard and the pastures and the stable doing the work of the ranch, meals with Ezra's cooking, and the long yellow evenings on the porch when the heat was just beginning to ease. But underneath the ordinary surface something was moving, the way water moved under winter ice, felt rather than seen. Alfred found himself timing his returns to the house around the hours when Celia worked. He told himself this was practical, that he needed to be available if she had questions about the records. This was not untrue. She did have questions, specific and well-framed questions that cut straight to the essential matter, and he answered them with the same directness, and then stood in the doorway of his own office watching her work and thinking about things he had no particular business thinking about. On the second evening she came out onto the porch just as the sun was going down and found him there with his coffee, watching the sky go orange over the distant caprock, and she sat in the other chair without ceremony and said, "It is bigger than I expected." He thought for a moment she meant the discrepancy in the books, but she was looking at the sky, and he realized she meant the land, the openness of it, the way the Texas plains ran out in every direction under the enormous bowl of the evening sky. "It takes some getting used to," he said. "When I first came out here I could not sleep for a week, too quiet, too wide." "Where did you come from?" "Ohio," he said. "Came west when I was 19 with a man named Calloway who had schemes. The schemes failed. I stayed." She smiled at that. A real one this time, not just the corner of her mouth but the full thing, and it changed her face the way lamplight changes a room, not adding anything that was not already there, just illuminating it. "What made you stay when the schemes failed?" she asked. "The land," he said simply. "I put my hands in it once, first spring, helping a homesteader with a field, and I thought, this is real. This does not lie to you. You put work into it and the work shows. There is no," he stopped and looked at the sky, "there is no pretending with land. It is what it is." Celia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father was like that about numbers. He said figures never lied to you if you read them honestly. The lie is always in the person recording them, never in the number itself." "Your father sounds like a man I would have liked," Alfred said. She looked at him with something quiet and genuine in her face. "He was," she said. "He would have liked you, I think." They sat in the evening air that smelled of dust and prairie grass, and the far-off rain that never quite arrived in June. And Alfred felt the wall he had spent years building between himself and every complication that wore a warm human face begin to develop, in its most carefully mortared section, something that felt uncomfortably like a crack. On the third morning Celia found the final piece. Alfred was at the desk with her when she set the pencil down and turned her notebook toward him and said, in a voice that was professional and precise and entirely steady, $209 over 14 months in total, 3 separate instances, all in transactions handled by Crenshaw, all underrecorded against receipts that he would have held himself as foreman. Your brother's mark is on every one of them." Alfred looked at the figures. The cold knife-edge anger was back, but cleaner now, less personal. It was the anger of a man who had the facts and knew what to do with them. "Is this sufficient for legal action?" he said. "Records are clear and the discrepancies are documented," Celia said. "Whether the circuit judge would take it to prosecution depends on whether you have the physical receipts. Do you?" "Doyle handles the receipts," Alfred said. "Then you may want to move quickly," she said, "before he realizes an audit has been done." Alfred was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why quickly?" "Because a man who has been stealing from you for 14 months will have planned for the possibility of discovery," Celia said. "Not planned for it specifically, but any man who steals with that level of patience has also thought about what he would do if he were caught." She met Alfred's eyes. He may already know I am here and why. Alfred set the notebook down. He thought about Doyle Crenshaw's face, the squinted expression and the flat steadiness of it, the way Doyle had been slightly less available than usual these last 3 days, slightly more occupied with tasks at the edges of the property. He thought about small things he had not thought to notice. "I will deal with it today," he said. "Do you want me present?" Celia asked. He looked at her. The question surprised him, not the offer but the straightforwardness of it, the simple willingness to be there if it helped. "No," he said, "but thank you." She nodded and picked up her pencil. He dealt with it that afternoon. He rode to where Doyle was working at the far northwest corner of the property, and he confronted him there, quietly on horseback, with the figures in his head and the cold anger doing what cold anger did best, keeping everything precise. He gave Doyle the numbers and watched Doyle's face go through several stages of calculation before settling, with the resigned defeat of a man who has been planning an escape route for 14 months and just found it blocked, into a kind of bleak honesty. Doyle did not deny it. He argued it was less than what it looked like, that some of it was error, that Alfred had misread the records. Alfred replied with the specific entries and the specific receipts, recited from Celia's meticulous notes, and watched Doyle run out of argument before the first cloud moved across the sun. He told Doyle to pack his things and go. He did not raise his voice. He told Doyle that if the money was returned, he would not go to the circuit judge, and Doyle accepted these terms with the practical desperation of a man who had no better options. By evening he was gone, his gear packed on a mule, the Granger spread behind him like a closed door. Alfred stood in the yard and watched the road for a while after Doyle left. Pete came and stood nearby without speaking, which Alfred appreciated. Pete was a good hand with the good sense to know when silence was the right offering. Then Alfred went inside and found Celia at the kitchen table with Ezra, who had apparently decided she was welcome there, and they were arguing amiably about some detail of frontier cooking, Celia maintaining that adding dried peppers to salt pork was an improvement, and Ezra maintaining that this was a matter of settled fact and needed no further argument since he was the one with the skillet. Alfred stopped in the doorway and watched them for a moment. Celia looked up and read his face with one quick glance and said quietly, "All right." "All right," he said. She nodded and turned back to her argument with Ezra, and Alfred went to wash his hands at the basin by the back door, and stood there for a long moment with the cool water over his hands, trying to identify what was happening in the vicinity of his chest, and whether it was a medical concern or something else entirely. He decided it was something else entirely and dried his hands and went to join the argument about dried peppers. On the 4th day, Celia finished the audit. She presented Alfred with a final written report at the office desk, the document clean and careful in her precise hand, every finding noted and every figure verified, and the total accounting of what had gone missing clearly laid out. She also included, in a separate section at the back, recommendations for a new accounting system for the ranch, a simpler method of cross-checking receipts that would make future discrepancies impossible to conceal. Alfred read the whole thing at the desk while she stood by the window and looked out at the yard, her hat off now because she had been inside, and her hair was partly loose from its pins in the way it got by afternoon, a loose strand at her temple that she did not seem to notice or care about. When he looked up from the report, she was watching a hawk in the distance, some small circling shape against the blue. "What you have done here," Alfred said, "is worth considerably more than what my brother paid." Celia turned from the window and looked at him. "The contract set the fee," she said. "I know what the contract set," Alfred said. "I am telling you that the value of the work exceeds the fee. I would like to pay the difference." She shook her head, not dismissively but firmly. "The work is done. The contract is fulfilled. It is a clean accounting." Alfred set the report down. "Miss Mercer," he said, and then found that what he wanted to say next was not a business matter and he was not sure quite how to proceed from here, which was an unusual experience for a man who had spent 20 years making decisions without particular hesitation. Celia looked at him with a faint expectancy, not impatient, just waiting, the way she always waited. "There is no reason for you to leave tomorrow," he said. She was quiet. "The stage from Amarillo does not come back through until Friday," he continued, which was true, and also, he was aware, not the primary reason he was saying this. "And I have 3 months of records from before Crenshaw's time that I would like verified, to be certain the problem did not begin earlier." Celia regarded him. Something in her expression was careful in a way it had not been before, as though she was reading an entry in a ledger that was less clear-cut than the others. "I can stay until Friday," she said at last. It was Tuesday. The 3 days between Tuesday and Friday were the days that Alfred Granger would spend the rest of his life understanding. Not in the way you understood something by thinking about it, but in the way you understood rain or the turning of seasons from the inside, from having lived through it. He showed her the ranch. Not because there was a professional reason for it. The records were in the office. The physical operation needed no financial inspection. But because on Wednesday morning he found himself outside her window at the top of the stairs, saying that if she wanted to see how the place ran she was welcome to ride along with him on the morning rounds. And she appeared at the door 10 minutes later in a riding habit that was clearly well used, with her hat at its angle and her dark auburn hair in a single braid. And she looked like she had ridden the plains her whole life, even though she had come from St. Joseph and the flat green hills of Missouri. He put her on Patience, because Patience was the steadiest horse in his stable, and also because Patience had taken to Celia with the same uncritical warmth that Cassius had demonstrated, and that the gray had shown in the paddock. And Alfred was beginning to feel that his horses had access to information he did not. They rode the eastern fence line and the creek bed and the north pasture where the cattle moved in the long grass. And Alfred watched her take in the ranch the way she took in the ledgers systematically, with genuine attention, the kind of looking that was not decoration. She asked questions that were specific and good, not the polite questions of a city visitor but the practical questions of a person trying to understand how things worked. She asked about the water rights along the creek. She asked about the grass management and whether he rotated the grazing sections. She asked about his arrangement with the buyer in Abilene and whether the contract was current. "You think like a rancher," Alfred said at some point. "I think like a bookkeeper," Celia said. "But a ranch is just a business with more mud." He laughed at that. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she looked at him sideways from under her hat brim with an expression that was warm and slightly surprised, as though she had not expected him to laugh. And Alfred realized that he probably had not laughed like that in quite some time. They stopped at noon at the high ground above the creek, where there was a wide flat rock that he had eaten lunch on 100 times, and Ezra had packed them a saddlebag with bread and dried meat, and a canteen of well water that was still cold. And they sat on the rock in the high summer sun and ate and looked out over the ranch from above, and Alfred felt something in him that he could only describe as contentment, which was both familiar and, in this specific configuration, entirely new. "What will you do when you go back?" he asked. "More of this," she said. "There are 4 other assessments waiting on my desk in Kansas City. One of them is a sheep operation up in Colorado which will be interesting." She paused. "Or not interesting. Sheep are their own education." "You prefer cattle country," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land below them. "I prefer this kind of country," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from her usual precision, something less contained. "I have been in a lot of offices in a lot of cities, and this is—" She stopped. "Wide," Alfred said. "Yes," she said. He was watching her profile against the sky, the line of her jaw and the way the braid fell over her shoulder, and the small, unconscious way she had turned her face to the sun, the way people did when they were feeling something good and were not thinking about being seen feeling it. He looked away from her and looked at the land. He thought about what it would mean if she came back. He thought about whether he would ask her to come back. He thought about what that would be, exactly. Whether it would be business or whether it would be something else. Whether he was capable of asking for something else. whether a woman who was capable of riding the morning rounds and reading the ledgers, and telling his horses apart by the quality of their tendon strain would have any interest in being asked for something else by a man who had lived alone on a cattle ranch in Texas for 4 years, and had made a virtue of his own simplicity. He thought about the rules. He had rewritten Rule 1 the morning she asked about the stable. He had rewritten Rule 2 before he knew he was doing it, had watched himself set the ledger in front of her with the helpless recognition of a man who has already made a decision before he has consciously framed the question. He had rewritten Rule 3 standing in the paddock at noon on the first day, with the gray horse between them and Pete Holly's, doing what he was told by a woman in a road-worn blue-gray dress who had spotted a tendon problem that Alfred had missed. Every rule he had built to protect himself had lasted exactly as long as it took Celia Mercer to have a reason to address it. And he found, sitting on this flat rock above his creek in the Texas noon sun, that he was not sorry. He was not sorry at all. He was, in fact, something close to grateful in a way he did not have vocabulary for yet. On Thursday evening after supper, with Ezra cleaning up in the kitchen and the blue dark coming down over the plain and the first stars beginning to appear, they were on the porch again in the 2 chairs, and Alfred had been building toward something all day with the patient deliberateness of a man who was going to say a thing and was going to say it right. "I would like you to stay longer," he said. "Not for the books." Celia had her coffee cup in both hands and she was looking at the darkening sky, and she was very still for a moment. "I know there are 4 assessments in Kansas City," he said. "I know the sheep operation in Colorado will be interesting or not interesting depending on the sheep. I know your work is important and you are very good at it." He paused. "I also know that, when you leave on Friday, I am going to spend the following months looking at the empty chair across from my desk and wondering what on earth I was thinking, letting the most capable and honest person I have met in 10 years ride back to Kansas City on a Tuesday stage." Celia turned her head and looked at him. The stars were coming out now and her face in the last of the light was very clear. "It is Thursday evening, Mr. Granger," she said, "not Monday morning. You are being very orderly about this." "I am always orderly," he said. "It is a character flaw some people have pointed out." "I think it is a character strength," she said. "Celia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and he heard the shift of it, the way it changed the air between them. She was quiet. "I am 31 years old and I have been building this ranch for 12 years, and I have done it alone because I believed I was better at it alone," he said. "I am beginning to think I was wrong about that. Not about the building, about the alone." She set her coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned in her chair to look at him fully. Her eyes in the starlight were dark and steady and completely present. "I have made my way for 6 years without any particular support from anyone," she said slowly, "and I have been proud of that. I have also been lonely in a very specific way that I have not had words for until this week, which is the loneliness of being capable and having no one beside you who recognizes what that costs." Alfred looked at her. "I recognize it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the problem." He reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand on the arm of her chair, not touching her, just placing his hand there in the vicinity of where her hand was, a question without pressure. She looked down at his hand. Then she turned hers over and put it against his, and they sat there in the Texas night with the stars building overhead and the horses moving quietly in the paddock and the sound of Ezra singing something tuneless in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a while. "Friday," Celia said at last. "What about Friday?" Alfred said. "I will need to send a telegraph to Kansas City," she said. "The firm will need to reassign the Colorado assessment." He went very still. Then he turned and looked at her, and she was looking back at him with that expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile, the one that he had been cataloging since the first morning. "You are staying," he said. "I am staying," she said. He did not shout. He did not jump up. He squeezed her hand and then sat back and looked at the stars and let out a long, slow breath that had about 12 years of solitude in it, and felt it dissolve into the warm, dark Texas air. "I still have terms," Celia said. "I know you do," Alfred said. "I am not a ranch wife who stays in the house," she said. "I will ride when I need to, and I will look at the books, and I will tell your hands what to do when I see something that needs doing, and I will talk to you like a partner and not an employee." "Those sound like rules," Alfred said. "Consider them counterbalancing," she said. He laughed again, that same unguarded laugh from the creek, and she laughed with him this time, and the sound of it went out into the dark night over the Granger spread, and dissolved into the prairie air the way water soaked into dry ground completely, and without remainder. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, and Alfred and Celia were both people of strong opinion and exact conviction, which meant they disagreed with some regularity and with considerable clarity. They disagreed about the cattle buyer in Abilene. Celia had reviewed the contract during her extended stay and believed the terms could be renegotiated to Alfred's advantage. And Alfred was of the opinion that a long-standing business relationship was worth more than a marginal improvement in rate. And they argued about this for 3 evenings running before Celia pulled out the figures and demonstrated mathematically that the improvement was not marginal. And Alfred conceded with the grace of a man who had promised himself. He would concede when he was wrong and meant to keep his promise. They disagreed about the hiring of Doyle's replacement. Alfred wanted to promote Pete, and Celia agreed that Pete was capable but suggested a 6-month trial with clear benchmarks rather than a direct promotion. And Alfred initially balked at this, and then thought about it for 2 days and told her she was right. They disagreed about the naming of the gray horse. Alfred wanted to call him Prospect. Celia said this was too precious for an animal with that much direct and unpretentious honesty about him. She suggested the name Oak. Alfred said this was a tree and not a horse name. Celia said trees were the most enduring things in the natural world, and there were worse qualities to invoke. Alfred considered this for an unreasonable amount of time, and then named the horse Oak, and told himself it had been his idea. He proposed in October, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather had finally relented from the brutal Texas summer, and the air was golden and clean, and the caprock in the distance glowed like something from a story. They were on horseback on the high ground above the creek, the same place they had eaten lunch on the Wednesday of her first week, and Alfred stopped Patience and looked at Celia on Oak. The gray had recovered fully from the tendon strain and was a sound and willing horse, especially under Celia, and said what he wanted to say with the directness of a man who had been planning his words carefully and believed in saying them correctly. He said he had never been particularly good at sentiment, but he was very good at knowing what was true. And what was true was that every morning since she had arrived on the stage from Amarillo had been a better morning than the ones before it. Not because she had made things easier, but because she had made them honest, and he wanted the honest mornings for the rest of his life. He said he did not have a ring with him because he had not wanted to presume, and she told him that was one of the most sensible and respectful things a man had ever said to her, and she said yes. They rode back to the ranch in the long golden afternoon light and told Ezra, who had apparently been expecting this development for some time, and had a bottle of whiskey ready that he must have hidden from Alfred's sight and Alfred's knowledge for approximately 3 months. And Pete and the other hands came in from the paddock when they heard the noise, and there was a general atmosphere of celebration that Alfred found both surprising and correct. The wedding was in December, in the small church in the nearest town of Harland, 7 miles north of the ranch. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Mr. Stokes, who was a practical man who kept his sermons short and his advice direct, and this suited Alfred and Celia both. Celia wore a dress of deep green wool that she had sent to Kansas City made by a seamstress she had worked with before, and it was not a grand dress, but it was exactly right, fitted for a woman who stood straight and moved with purpose. Alfred stood at the front of the church in his best coat and watched her walk down the aisle on no one's arm because she had no family present and had decided, with typical decisive logic, that if she was walking into this, it was under her own direction. He watched her walk toward him and felt the same thing he had felt on the porch on Thursday evening, with the stars coming out over the plain, the particular completeness of a thing that has found its proper fit, like a tenon into a mortise, the satisfaction of a structure that would hold. They exchanged their vows in the flat, clear voices of two people who meant every word, and when it was done, Alfred took her hand and Celia squeezed it once, hard, the way she had on the porch, and then they walked back down the aisle together into the cold December sunlight. The first year of their marriage was one of the fullest years Alfred had experienced since the years of building the ranch from nothing, and it was full in a completely different way. Not the fullness of labor and isolation and the satisfaction of visible progress, but the fullness of shared work, shared argument, shared understanding. The ranch changed under the joint management, not dramatically, not in ways that were visible from the outside, but in the way a mechanism changes when it is properly calibrated, running truer and more efficiently without visible effort. Celia set up a new accounting system that she had designed herself, based on the recommendations in her final audit report, and she trained Pete in the basics of it so that the records were not dependent on any single person to be accurate. She renegotiated the Abilene contract in March as she had planned to do, and the new terms added enough to the annual income to fund the resetting of the eastern fence posts and the purchase of 2 additional breeding mares that Alfred had been considering for 2 years. She also, in ways that were harder to quantify but no less real, changed the culture of the ranch in small ways. She had a gift for making the hands feel their work was seen, not sentimental about it, not given to compliments that cost nothing, but precise and specific acknowledgement of good work when it happened, delivered in the same direct manner she brought to everything. Alfred watched this and learned from it in the way he had learned the land itself, by observation, by patience, by being willing to recognize the limits of what he had understood before. Ezra adored her completely and without reservation. This manifested primarily as an ongoing argument about cooking that had no resolution, and both parties seemed to prefer it that way. In the early summer of that first year, a situation arose that tested the partnership in a way that neither of them had foreseen. There was a family, the Hawthorns, who had a homestead about 4 miles east of the Granger property, on land that was technically within their claim, but had been a point of dispute with a neighboring rancher named Birch for 2 years running. The Hawthorns were not Alfred's concern by any standard measure. They were not tenants, not employees, not connected to the Granger spread by any business arrangement. But they had a water access problem, and the water problem was directly connected to a dam that had been illegally diverted by Birch to cut off their creek access. Alfred knew about it. He had known about it in the peripheral way you knew about things that were not your immediate business on a frontier where everyone's business had a tendency to bleed into everyone else's. He had a vague intention to speak to someone official about it at some point, but these things moved slowly. Celia went to see the Hawthorns. She did this on a Tuesday when Alfred was at the northern pasture and she took Oak, and she came home in the afternoon with a particular look on her face that Alfred had learned to recognize as the look she wore when she had gathered information and was deciding what to do with it. "The Hawthorne family has 4 children," she said. "The youngest is 3. They have been without reliable water access for 6 weeks. The nearest alternative source is a 3-mile trip each way. The woman is doing that trip twice a day with a cart." Alfred set down what he was doing and looked at his wife. "I know Birch," Alfred said. "He has been trying to pressure small homesteaders off that land for 2 years. He wants the East Quarter for grazing expansion." "What are you going to do about it?" Celia said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question the kind she asked when she wanted to know where someone stood before she decided how to proceed. "I am going to Harlan tomorrow," Alfred said. "I will speak to Judge Colburn about the water rights and have a formal complaint registered against Birch's diversion. And I will run a line from our East Creek to the Hawthorne property's edge as a temporary measure until the legal matter is sorted." Celia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I will write up the documentation, water rights records and the evidence of the illegal diversion, laid out in proper form. It will carry more weight with the judge." "I know," Alfred said. They worked on it together that evening at the office desk, side by side, Alfred providing the local knowledge and Celia organizing it into the formal documentation that said what needed to be said in the language that official proceedings required. The judge received the complaint and ruled in the Hawthorns' favor within 3 weeks, and Birch's diversion was ordered removed, and the water came back to where it belonged. Alfred thought about this often afterward, not as an act of particular heroism, but as an example of something he had not known to look for in himself until Celia had shown him the shape of it, the difference between knowing something was wrong and being moved to do something about it. He had always been a fair man, by his own accounting. He had always intended, in a general way, to be decent. But intention without action, Celia had shown him by example, was just a comfortable feeling that helped you sleep while other people went without water. The injustice of the frontier was real, and it was everywhere, pressed down on the people with the least land and the least legal standing, the homesteaders, the families trying to build something small in the shadow of larger operations, the communities that had no one to speak for them in the official rooms where decisions were made. Alfred began to notice these things more. He began to put himself in the rooms where decisions were made and say what needed to be said. Celia had not told him to do this. She had simply shown him by doing it herself, and he had followed because the man he wanted to be was the man who followed that example. In the autumn of that first year, Pete Hollis proved himself fully as foreman, navigating a difficult cattle movement during an early cold snap with steady leadership and good judgment. And Alfred made the promotion official and gave Pete the foreman's cabin that Doyle Crenshaw had once occupied. Pete thanked Alfred with a handshake and thanked Celia with a slightly reddened face and the declaration that she was the best judge of cattle and horses and men he had ever worked with, which was, from Pete, the equivalent of a flowery speech. Celia accepted this with a smile that managed to be both genuinely pleased and completely unsentimental. By the second spring of their marriage, Celia told Alfred one morning at the breakfast table, with the characteristic directness that had never once varied, that she was expecting their first child. She said it in the middle of a conversation about the spring cattle count, and she said it with the same matter-of-fact clarity she used for everything. But her hands around her coffee cup were slightly tighter than usual, and Alfred understood that under the steadiness she was feeling all the things that people felt about beginnings. He got up from his chair and went around the table and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment with everything he had never been particularly good at saying visible in his expression. And then he kissed her forehead and sat back down and said, "We are going to need another horse." She laughed so hard she nearly knocked over the coffee, and it was the sound of it, that real, unguarded laugh, that Ezra heard from the cookhouse and came in to investigate. And when he understood what had happened, he sat down at the kitchen table and wept without embarrassment, because Ezra had been on the ranch long enough to want this for Alfred in a deep and patient way that he had never once mentioned aloud. The child was born in November, a fine, cold, clear November morning with the sky like blue glass outside the window of the upstairs bedroom, where Celia lay in the bed with the midwife from Harlan in attendance, and Alfred downstairs wearing a path in the floorboards between the kitchen and the foot of the stairs. When the cry came, he was up those stairs before the echo faded, and the midwife met him at the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Granger. Mother and child are well." Alfred went in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Celia, who was tired in the profound way of someone who has just done the hardest possible thing, and at the infant in her arms, who was small and red and furiously alive. "A son," Celia said. She was looking at the child with an expression that Alfred had never seen on her face before, not the focused assessment, not the concentrated precision, but something open and vast and undefended, the way the plane looked after rain when the light came through. "He looks very determined," Alfred said. "He comes by it honestly," she said. They named him Daniel James Granger, for Alfred's brother and Celia's father both, two names carried forward from the people who had brought them to this particular moment by paths that had nothing obvious about them. The small ranch house in the Texas plains, the books in the office, the horses in the stable, the flat rock above the creek, all of it gathering in a single point represented by one small, insistent person who had arrived in November and immediately made the ranch a completely different place. Daniel grew up between the books and the horses, which was perhaps inevitable. He had Celia's dark eyes and Alfred's serious mouth, and the particular fearlessness of a child who has been raised to believe that honest work and direct speech are the tools you need for most problems, and that you ask for help when you need it and say thank you when you get it. Alfred rebuilt the guest room into a proper nursery in the first year, and built an addition on the back of the house in the second because the ranch was prospering well enough to warrant the space. The cattle operation expanded. A second set of breeding mares produced well. Pete ran the hands with the steady capability Alfred had always expected of him, and the Granger spread became the kind of ranch that other ranchers in the county referred to as a model operation, which Alfred found moderately embarrassing and Celia found completely accurate. When Daniel was 3 years old, Celia told Alfred there would be a second child, this time in the spring. She told him at the breakfast table again, and this time Alfred got up and went around the table and held her and did not say anything about horses, and she laughed against his shoulder without needing the joke. The second child was a daughter, born in April when the wildflowers were pushing up through the still cool ground, and the prairie was as close to green as it got in a good year. They named her Ruth Mary Granger, for Alfred's Aunt Ruth, who had taken Daniel in during his illness and who had written Alfred a long and gracious letter when she heard about the marriage, and for Celia's mother, who was living still in St. Joseph, and who made the difficult journey to Texas the following summer to meet her grandchildren and to sit on the porch in the evenings and look at the enormous sky and tell Celia in a quiet voice that she had done well. She had done so well. The children grew. The ranch grew. The years moved the way years did on working land, not fast, not slow, but with the continuous reliable turning of seasons that was its own kind of abundance. On a June morning several years into their life together, the 14th, though neither of them noted the date consciously at first, Alfred woke before Celia and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen while the coffee came up on the stove and watched the dawn come over the flat line of the plains through the east window. He had stood in this kitchen 10,000 mornings or thereabouts, and he stood in it this morning as a man who knew every board in the floor by feel, and every sound the house made in the wind, and the way the light moved across the room from east to west over the course of a day. He heard Celia on the stairs, her step quick and light the way it always was, and she came into the kitchen with her hair down. She had started leaving it down in the morning some time ago, a small private concession to a life that now had private moments in it. And she came to the stove and poured the first cup of coffee before it had quite finished, and handed it to him with the same matter-of-fact care she brought to every ordinary thing. He held the cup and looked at her and said, "Do you know what day it is?" She was pouring her own cup and she considered this. Then she said, "June the 14th. He said, "The stage from Amarillo came through the gate on June the 14th, 7 in the morning 4 years ago." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had not changed, that were still as direct and as lit from inside as they had been over the ledgers in the first morning's light of their acquaintance. She said, "You remember that?" "I remember everything," he said. She came and leaned against the counter beside him with her coffee cup, shoulder against his shoulder, the easy closeness of two people who had learned the geography of each other thoroughly and inhabited it without self-consciousness. "I thought you were going to send me back on the same stage," she said. "I thought about it," he said, "for approximately 8 minutes. What changed your mind?" He thought about it honestly. Then he said, "Cassius." She turned and looked at him. "The horse," he said. "He liked you immediately. He does not like anyone immediately. I thought if Cassius trusts the judgment, I probably should too." She was quiet for a moment, and then she made the sound she made when something genuinely amused her, the small private sound that was better than any laugh, and put her head briefly against his shoulder. "I am very glad," she said quietly, "that your horse has good taste." "So am I," Alfred said. They stood in the June kitchen with the coffee getting cool, and the sun coming up through the east window, and Daniel making noises upstairs that meant he was awake and would shortly be downstairs and hungry, and Ruth asleep still in the nursery down the hall, and the horses in the paddock beginning their morning calls, and the whole of the Granger ranch settling into another ordinary day that was, like all the ordinary days, everything. The rules had been rewritten. All 3 of them before noon on the first day, by a woman in a road-worn blue-gray dress who had never known they existed, and had broken them not out of disregard, but out of the simple pressure of necessity and competence, and the particular kind of courage that looked, from the outside, a great deal like ordinary confidence. Alfred had replaced them with things that suited the life he actually had rather than the life he had built walls to protect himself from. The first new rule was simply this: Celia could go anywhere on the ranch she needed to go, because her judgment about what needed her attention was better than his rules about what should be off-limits, and he had trusted her with everything that mattered, and there was no point in cordoning off anything smaller than that. The second new rule was that the books were theirs, not his, because a ledger balanced by 2 honest people was twice as secure as one that only one person touched, and because the ranch was theirs in the same way, not mine or yours, but ours, which was a word that Alfred had been reluctant to use for most of his life, and now used without thinking, naturally, the way you used the names of things you lived among. The third new rule was the simplest of all. On this ranch, whoever had good information and good judgment spoke up and was listened to, regardless of anything else, because a ranch that ran on anything less than the best available understanding was a ranch that was leaving something on the table. This meant Celia gave directions when she had reason to, and Alfred's men listened because she was right more often than she was wrong, and they had all of them long since understood this to be true. 3 rules rewritten. Every one of them better than what it had replaced. Daniel came downstairs in his bare feet, making the particular stomping noise that 3-year-olds made to announce themselves, and Celia went to him and picked him up with the ease of a woman who had discovered, to her own apparent surprise, that she had a talent for the physical work of mothering that had no analog in anything else she did. Just a direct, warm, capable care that the children responded to with the same uncritical trust that Cassius had shown on the first morning. Alfred watched her carry his son to the breakfast table and put him in his chair and pour the milk, and set it in front of him, and answer the rapid and entirely incoherent questions that small children asked before breakfast with the same thoughtful attention she gave to every question she was asked. And he felt, as he often felt in these ordinary moments, the particular shock of gratitude that he suspected was what people meant when they talked about being in love as a state of being rather than an event. He had been told by various sources over his 30-some years that love was a feeling that came and went, that you had to maintain it the way you maintained a fence constantly, with effort, replacing the posts that rotted and resetting the ones that leaned. This was partly true. The maintenance was real. The effort was real. But what he had not been told, or what he had not had the experience to understand when he was told it, was that it was also something that accumulated, That did not diminish with time and familiarity, but became instead more precise, more specific, more like knowledge in the deepest sense. The way you knew land you had worked for 20 years in a way you could never know land you had bought last week. He knew Celia. He knew the exact sound of her footstep on the stair, the particular way she held her pencil when she was concentrating, the shade of expression that crossed her face when she was about to say something she knew he would not immediately agree with. He knew that she liked the mornings best and was less patient in the late afternoon, that she could read a horse's mood in 30 seconds but found it harder to read people she had just met, that she kept every promise she made and therefore made them carefully. She knew him in the same way. She knew when he needed to be left alone to think, and when he was pretending to be alone to think but actually wanted company. She knew that his fairness ran deep but needed sometimes to be pointed in the right direction. She knew that he laughed more than he had in a long time, because she had told him so once, in a way that was both observation and gift. Outside the kitchen window the June morning was advancing. The ranch was awake, Pete's voice in the near distance, the horses moving, the particular summer warmth beginning to build toward the long afternoon. Inside the kitchen Daniel was eating with the concentration of a small person for whom this was the most important activity in the world, and Ruth had begun to stir in the nursery down the hall, and Ezra would be along to start the cookhouse fire in the next half hour. Alfred came to the table and sat down across from his wife and his son, and looked at the morning light in the room, and the coffee steaming, and the whole ordinary, beautiful, particular substance of the life he had, and thought, as he often thought in these moments, in the private part of his mind that was not given to sentiment but made an exception here, in this kitchen, on these mornings, that he had been wrong about everything that mattered and right about nothing, and that this was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Celia looked up from Daniel's cup and met his eyes across the table, and her expression was the one she reserved for when she was saying something important without words, which she was better at than speech, which was saying something. He reached across and put his hand on hers, the same way he had on the porch on that Thursday evening with the stars coming out, and she turned her hand over under his and they held on, briefly, easily, the way people held on to things they intended to keep. Ruth's voice came from down the hall, the high, sweet sound of a baby waking into a good morning, and Celia rose to go to her, and Alfred rose to finish the coffee and get ready for the day, and Daniel said something about horses that required a thoughtful response, and the ranch went on turning in the bright Texas morning as it had and as it would. Built on the bones of hard work and honest numbers and the particular grace of two people who had each been alone long enough to know exactly what they were choosing when they chose otherwise. The Granger spread prospered for many years. The records were clean. The horses were sound. The lands were worked with care. The children grew into people worth knowing. And every June 14th, without fail, Alfred Granger was at the fence line at 7 in the morning, and he looked at the gate and thought about the shape of things before they changed, and was grateful, with the full specific accuracy of a man who kept honest accounts, that nothing had stayed the same.